Listen closely. Do you hear that? That's the sound of 10,000 men typing love letters at 2 a.m. to women who will read them while texting someone else. It's the symphony of the modern Sisyphus. Except instead of pushing a boulder up a mountain, he's pushing his dignity down into the earth, one desperate "you up" text at a time. There's an old Persian tale about a merchant who fell in love with fire. Not metaphorically, literally. He saw a flame dancing in a brazier one winter night and became convinced it was a jinn princess trapped in amber light. Every evening, he would sit before it, whispering poetry, offering jewels that turned to ash, extending his hands closer and closer until the skin bubbled and split. The other merchants called him mad. But here's the thing they never understood. He wasn't crazy. He was just doing what every man does when he mistakes consumption for connection. The only difference? His burns were visible. You see, Diogenes, that magnificent bastard who lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. He understood something we've forgotten in our age of dating apps and carefully curated Instagram personas. He watched men chase after women the way dogs chase carriages, and he laughed. Not because he hated women, but because he recognized the spectacular stupidity of making your happiness contingent on catching something that, by its very nature, must remain free. The modern man has become a peculiar creature. He downloads 17 dating apps, swipes until his thumb develops a repetitive strain injury, crafts his profile with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, all to attract someone who will eventually text him, "We need to talk on a Tuesday afternoon." He performs masculinity like a trained seal, balancing the ball of emotional availability on his nose, while simultaneously juggling the hoops of financial success, physical fitness, and mysterious aloofness. And for what? For the privilege of being chosen by someone who's been taught since birth that her value lies in how many seals she can make perform. Here's what they don't tell you in those pickup artist forums that smell of desperation and Axe body spray. The very act of chasing transforms you into prey. You become the rabbit convinced it's hunting the fox, too intoxicated by the chase to notice you're running straight into the trap. Every compromise you make, every piece of yourself you shave away to fit into her ideal. You're not becoming more lovable, you're becoming less human. You're turning into a hologram of desire, a ghost that haunts its own life. Think about it. When was the last time you did something purely for yourself? Not to impress her, not to become relationship material, not to tick off boxes on some imaginary checklist of masculine achievement. When did you last sit in absolute silence without immediately reaching for your phone to see if she's texted back? You've become Pavlov's dog, except instead of salivating at the sound of a bell, your entire nervous system lights up at the sight of those 3 dots appearing and disappearing in a message thread. The ancient Stoics had a word for this. Path, the passions that disturb the soul's tranquility. But we've renamed it love and convinced ourselves it's noble. We've taken what should be a garden and turned it into a gladiatorial arena, where men bleed out their authenticity for the entertainment of an audience that's already swiping to the next show. There's a study from 2024, fresh off the psychological presses, that found men in relationships report lower levels of personal autonomy than their single counterparts, yet simultaneously claim higher life satisfaction. The researchers called it hedonic adaptation, but I call it what it really is. Stockholm Syndrome with dinner dates. You've been held hostage by your own hormones for so long, you've started sympathizing with your captor. The velvet curtains of romance, heavy with the perfume of promise. They hide something grotesque. A man so afraid of his own solitude that he'd rather burn alive in bad love than sit peacefully in his own company. The candle wax of countless dinner dates pools on the table, hardening into monuments to conversations, where you pretended to care about her friend's drama while your soul quietly filed for bankruptcy. So here's my question for you, whispered like a curse in a cathedral. What would happen if you simply stopped? Not stopped loving, but stopped chasing, stopped performing, stopped treating your heart like currency in an economy that's been rigged from the start. What if, like Diogenes with his lantern, you went searching not for an honest woman or an honest man, but for an honest version of yourself, the one you buried under all that desperate wanting? But perhaps that's too much truth for one sitting. Perhaps you need to believe the fire loves you back. Every woman you didn't approach is a ghost that haunts a house you'll never live in. In the garden of forking paths, each turn untaken grows its own dark bloom. Regret is just desire wearing a death mask, dancing alone in yesterday's room. There's a bar in Prague, or maybe it's Budapest, or maybe it exists only in the collective unconscious of every man who's ever stood frozen at the edge of possibility, where the walls are covered in photographs of moments that never happened, pictures of first kisses that stopped at eye contact, wedding photos of people who sat on opposite ends of the same train car for 2 years, crafting entire lives together in their minds while never speaking a word. It's called the Museum of Missed Connections. And brother, you've been contributing to its collection your whole life. But here's the sick joke. The cemetery of could-have-beens is more crowded than any actual relationship graveyard. For every woman who rejected you, there are 10 you never even gave the chance to say no. You've been having staring contests with opportunity while possibility grew old and died in the waiting room of your courage. Schopenhauer once wrote that we swing like pendulums between boredom and suffering. But he forgot to mention the third position, paralysis. That exquisite purgatory where you're simultaneously terrified of rejection and tortured by inaction. You become like those Victorian gentlemen who died of consumption, except your disease is assumption. You assume she's out of your league. You assume she has a boyfriend. You assume, until assumption becomes your autobiography. I knew a man once. Let's call him Marcus, because all cautionary tales need a Marcus, who fell in love with a barista. Every morning for 3 years, he ordered the same cortado, left the same tip, exchanged the same 7 words. Cortado, please. Coming right up. Thanks. Have a good one. 3 years, 1,095 days of carefully rehearsed casualness. He knew her schedule, noticed when she changed her hair, memorized the way she laughed at her co-workers' jokes. In his mind, they'd already moved to Portland, adopted a retriever named Kafka, and started a small pottery business. Then one day, she wasn't there. Quit, the manager said. Moved to Barcelona with her girlfriend. Marcus still goes to that coffee shop, orders the same cortado. But now he knows what he always suspected. He wasn't just ordering coffee. He was purchasing cowardice, 1 cup at a time. You see, we've created this mythology around the one that got away. But we never acknowledge that most of them never even knew they were supposed to be caught. We're ghosts haunting our own lives, invisible to the very people we claim to desire. And the truly grotesque part? We've convinced ourselves this is noble. We call it respecting boundaries, when really it's just fear wearing a 3-piece suit of rationalization. A 2023 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people consistently overestimate the negative consequences of rejection, while underestimating their ability to recover from it. The anticipated pain is always worse than the actual experience. We're essentially torturing ourselves with a horror movie that never gets made, directed by anxiety, produced by insecurity, with our ego playing every role. The humid summer evenings you'll never spend with her stick to your skin like regret. The conversations you've had with her in your shower could fill libraries. You know her, the version of her that exists exclusively in your skull. The one who always laughs at your jokes, never has bad breath, never scrolls through her phone while you're talking about your childhood trauma. This imaginary woman is perfect because she's not real. She's a projection, a hologram of longing, a ghost you've fallen in love with because ghosts can't reject you. They can only haunt. And haunt, they do. Every woman you didn't approach becomes a specter in your peripheral vision. You'll see her decades later. Not her, but women who remind you of her. And feel that familiar ache, like a phantom limb pain for a life you never actually lived. You'll wonder what would have happened if you just said hello. But here's the savage truth. Nothing would have happened, or something would have happened. But either way, it would have been real. And reality is the one thing your fantasy can't survive. Kierkegaard understood this when he wrote about the aesthetic existence, living in the realm of possibility without ever committing to actuality. You've become a connoisseur of maybes, a collector of perhaps, a museum curator in the gallery of what if. But museums are for dead things, and every moment you spend there is a moment you're not alive. The cruelest part? While you're mourning the ghosts of relationships that never existed, actual women, flesh and blood and morning breath, and complicated feelings about their fathers are walking past you. But you don't see them because you're too busy staring at shadows, mistaking your fear for reverence, your paralysis for patience. So riddle me this, you curator of cowardice. How many ghosts can dance on the head of a pin before the pin realizes it was never sharp enough to draw blood? How many imaginary lovers does it take to equal one real rejection? When will you realize that the cemetery of could-have-beens is just another name for the life you're currently living? Freedom tastes like copper pennies and loneliness, but slavery tastes like her lipstick. Shh. Lean in close. I'm going to tell you a secret that men whisper to their bathroom mirrors at 3 a.m., but never say aloud in daylight. Sometimes being controlled feels like being loved. There's a Japanese folktale about a bunraku puppet who gained consciousness but chose to keep performing. Every night, he felt the puppeteer's hands inside him, moving his wooden limbs in predetermined patterns, speaking words through his carved mouth that weren't his own. The other puppets, still unconscious, didn't know they were enslaved. But he knew, and he chose it anyway. Because without the puppeteer's hands, he was just dead wood with a painted smile, alone in a prop closet, gathering dust. Sound familiar? You've memorized her coffee order like a prayer. 2 pumps vanilla, oat milk, extra hot, no foam. The rosary of the romantically domesticated. You know which restaurants she'll reject before you even suggest them. You've deleted friends from your phone because she got a weird vibe from them. Your Netflix account has become a shrine to reality shows about people getting married in increasingly absurd circumstances. You haven't watched a single thing you actually wanted to watch in 17 months? But hey, at least you're not alone, right? The modern relationship has become a peculiar form of voluntary servitude. You trade your sovereignty for the promise of consistent sex and someone to list as your emergency contact. But here's what Nietzsche knew when he wrote about the will to power. The moment you surrender your will to another, you don't become half of a whole. You become a fraction of yourself, and fractions, by definition, are always less than one. I once watched a man, successful surgeon, drove a Tesla before it was insufferable to drive a Tesla, sit in a parking lot for 45 minutes because his girlfriend was almost ready to leave her friend's house. 45 minutes in a parking lot, scrolling through his phone, occasionally checking his watch, sending her heart emojis every time she texted, 5 more minutes, babe. This man had literally held human hearts in his hands, had made decisions that determined whether people lived or died. And here he was, a puppet waiting for permission to exist. But here's the truly sick part. He was grateful. Grateful to be needed, even if that need was just to be a taxi service with emotional labor. Grateful to be claimed, even if that claim felt like a leash. We've confused possession with passion, control with care. We've become so terrified of solitude that we'll accept captivity as long as it comes with a goodnight text. The velvet prison of a relationship. Soft walls that you don't realize are walls until you try to leave. She decorates your cage with throw pillows and scented candles from Target, and suddenly it smells too much like vanilla and live, laugh, love to remember what freedom tasted like. Your boys stop calling because you always have to check with her first. Your hobbies atrophy like unused muscles. Your dreams get filed away under maybe someday when she's ready. A 2024 study from the University of Copenhagen found that men in long-term relationships showed decreased activity in the brain regions associated with independent decision-making. The researchers called it cognitive offloading. But what it really means is you've outsourced your free will to someone who thinks The Bachelor is quality television. You know what Diogenes did when Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds? He plucked a chicken and declared, "Behold, Plato's human." The savage beauty of that act wasn't just in its humor, it was in its refusal to accept comfortable definitions. But you've let her define you. You're her boyfriend first, everything else second. You're the featherless biped she plucked, except instead of feathers, you lost your edge, your spontaneity, your magnificent, chaotic freedom to be undefined. The strings feel like a hug until you try to move in a direction she hasn't choreographed. Then they become what they always were, instruments of control, wrapped in gift paper and called love. You tell yourself you're choosing this, that compromise is what adults do. But compromise implies both parties are giving something up. What has she surrendered that equals your entire personality? Here's what they never tell you about being alone. It's not the silence that's terrifying. It's the sound of your own thoughts without someone else's voice drowning them out. It's the weight of your own choices without someone else to blame when they go wrong. It's the magnificent, terrible freedom to fail on your own terms rather than succeed on someone else's. The puppet in the Japanese tale? One night the puppeteer died. The puppet waited for those familiar hands that never came. By morning, he was just wood again. But for one brief hour between the death and the dawn, he moved his own strings. Clumsy, uncertain, but his. And in that hour, he lived more than in all his years of perfect performance. So here's my accusation, delivered with the tenderness of a knife between ribs. You're not afraid she'll leave you. You're afraid that if she does, you'll have to admit you haven't been living. You've been performing. And the show? It was never for you. You've been the puppet who fell in love with his strings, mistaking manipulation for meaning, choreography for choice. But there's still time to cut them, if you have the courage to hold the scissors. Domestication is just another word for forgetting you have teeth. There's a moment, and if you're honest, you'll remember it with the clarity of a scar, when you stopped being dangerous. Not violent, not cruel, but dangerous in the way that wild things are dangerous. Unpredictable, untamed, magnificently indifferent to the world's attempts to categorize you. You traded your howl for a whimper, your hunt for a food bowl, your wilderness for a suburb with good schools and a homeowners association that measures your grass with a ruler. The Lakota have a saying, The wolf that stays too long at the campfire forgets the taste of raw meat. But they don't tell you the rest of the story. How that wolf becomes a dog, and how that dog spends the rest of his life dreaming of forests he'll never run through again. His domesticated heart racing at the distant sound of howling he can no longer produce. You used to be interesting. Remember? Before you learned to moderate your opinions, like a Reddit comment section. Before you started speaking in human resources vernacular, using words like synergy and circle back, without dying inside. You had edges once, sharp enough to cut, rough enough to catch on things. Now you're smooth as a river stone, worn down by the constant flow of compromise until you're palatable enough to skip across the surface of polite society without causing a ripple. I watch men at bars now, not the young ones. They still have their milk teeth. But the ones in their 30s and 40s, wearing their exhaustion like a merit badge. They talk about their wives the way prisoners talk about wardens, with a mixture of resentment and Stockholm syndrome that would be fascinating if it weren't so grotesque. Happy wife, happy life, they say, and laugh like they're not confessing to a murder-suicide pact where they're both victim and perpetrator. The transformation is almost beautiful in its completeness. You go from sending 2 a.m. texts that say thinking of you to setting calendar reminders for anniversary dinners. From spontaneous road trips to asking permission to go to the gym. From reading Bukowski in coffee shops to hiding your credit card statements. You become a domesticated version of yourself, house-trained and neutered, performing tricks for treats, rolling over on command. A 2025 neuroscience study from MIT found something horrifying and hilarious. Men in long-term relationships show similar brain patterns to animals in captivity. The same learned helplessness, the same reduced hippocampal volume, the same diminished stress responses that look like calm but are actually just resignation. You're not relaxed, you're resigned. There's a difference, and it tastes like quiet desperation mixed with craft beer and weekend barbecues. But here's where it gets truly dark, where even I have to light another candle just to push back the shadows. You did this to yourself. No one forced you to file down your canines. No one held a gun to your head and made you trade your leather jacket for a North Face vest. You chose comfort over courage, security over sovereignty. And now you're the wolf who learned to love his cage. Because at least it's warm and the food comes regularly. Diogenes masturbated in public. When criticized, he said, "If only I could satisfy my hunger by rubbing my belly." The absolute madman understood something we've forgotten in our quest to be good men. Authenticity is obscene. Real authenticity, not the Instagram version. It's obscene because it refuses to apologize for its appetites. Refuses to pretend that civilization has conquered nature. Refuses to act like we're anything other than barely evolved apes who learn to wear ties and pretend we don't want to scream. You know what's in your browser history. You know what thoughts cross your mind during the commute. You know the savage, strange, beautiful monster you've buried under layers of social acceptability. But you've buried him so deep, covered him with so much concrete of conformity, that even you've forgotten where you put the shovel. The saddest part? Women don't actually want the domesticated version. Oh, they say they do. They make lists about emotional availability and communication skills, but watch their eyes when a dangerous man walks into the room. Not violent, but wild. Watch how their entire nervous system responds to someone who hasn't been house-trained, who still smells like freedom and bad decisions. They're attracted to the wolf, but they marry the dog, and then spend the rest of the relationship wondering why he won't howl anymore. There's still wildness in you. I can smell it beneath the cologne and the compromise. It's there in the moment between sleep and waking, when you forget who you're supposed to be. It's there in the songs you only sing in the car when you're alone. It's there in the dreams where you're running, not from something, but toward something, though you can never quite remember what when you wake up. The cage is real. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. The door was never locked. You've been pressing against bars that would open if you just tried the handle, but you won't. Because the cage is comfortable now. Because you've decorated it with your achievements and your routines. Because freedom means you might fail, might be rejected, might die alone. And you'd rather die in captivity than live in uncertainty. So here's my dare, whispered like a prayer for the damned. Go howl at something, tonight. Doesn't matter what. Drive to where the city lights end and scream at the indifferent stars. Say no to something you're supposed to say yes to. Say yes to something that scares you. Remember just for a moment what it felt like to have teeth. But you won't. And that's the real tragedy. The wolf who learned to love his cage doesn't even remember he's a wolf. Solitude isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of self. Listen. Do you hear that? That's the sound of absolutely nothing expecting anything from you. No good morning texts to send. No anniversaries to remember. No emotional labor to perform. No one's mood to manage but your own. It's terrifying, isn't it? That's silence. Most men would rather drown in dysfunction than learn to swim in their own company. But not you. Not anymore. You've arrived at the final revelation. The one that tastes like black coffee at 4 a.m. and feels like walking into an empty house that's entirely, unapologetically yours. There's an old Sufi story about a king who gave away his kingdom to sit by a river and watch the water flow. His advisors thought he'd gone mad. His family staged interventions. The neighboring kingdoms prepared to invade, certain that a man who would choose nothing over everything must be weak. But the king just sat there, watching the river, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't performing kingship. He was just being. And being, it turns out, is the one thing no one can teach you when you're too busy becoming what others expect. Diogenes lived in a barrel, not because he had to, but because he wanted to prove that a man needs almost nothing to be complete. When Alexander the Great asked him what he desired, Diogenes asked him to move out of his sunlight. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world offered him anything, and all Diogenes wanted was for him to stop casting shadows. That's the kind of sovereign indifference that makes empires nervous. You've been told that being alone means you're broken. That solitude is just loneliness with a philosophy degree. That a man without a woman is like a fish without a bicycle. Wait, that's backwards. But you get the idea. Society has made you so terrified of your own company that you'd rather be miserable with someone else than content by yourself. But here's what they don't want you to discover. Solitude is a superpower disguised as a curse. In solitude, you can eat cereal for dinner without anyone commenting on your nutritional choices. You can watch the same movie 17 times without explaining why. You can sit in absolute silence without someone asking what you're thinking about. You can be inconsistent, contradictory, complex. You can change your mind without a committee meeting. You can fail without an audience. You can succeed without sharing the credit. A 2024 Harvard study on solitude found something remarkable. Men who spent regular time alone showed increased creativity, improved emotional regulation, and, here's the kicker, reported feeling more connected to others when they did socialize. Turns out, you can't give what you don't have. And if you don't have a self, all you're offering others is an echo of their own expectations. But here's where it gets beautiful, where the darkness cracks and something else leaks through. When you stop chasing, something extraordinary happens. You become the still point around which the world revolves. Women notice a man who isn't trying to be noticed. It's like that quantum physics experiment where observing the particle changes its behavior. Except you've stopped observing, stopped wanting, stopped needing, and suddenly you become magnetic in your indifference. I know a man, successful artist, genuinely content alone, who hasn't pursued a woman in 5 years. Not out of bitterness, not from trauma, but from a simple recognition that he'd rather be alone than be with someone who doesn't add to his solitude. And women find him fascinating. They orbit him like planets around a sun that doesn't care if it has planets. Some stay, some go, but he remains constant, creating his art, living his life, refusing to compromise his solitude for companionship that would cost him his sovereignty. The Japanese have a word, ikigai, your reason for being. But we've corrupted it in the West, turned it into another productivity hack, another way to optimize yourself for market value. The real ikigai isn't about finding your purpose in relation to others. It's about finding what makes you want to get up in the morning when no one else is watching, when there's no one to impress, when the only audience is the face in the mirror that's finally stopped lying to itself. You can become the king of nothing. And nothing is not emptiness. It's potential. It's the blank canvas that doesn't need to become a painting. It's the silence that doesn't need to be filled with words. It's the Friday night with no plans that doesn't feel like failure. It's the wedding you attend alone and leave early because you want to, not because you have no one to slow dance with during that last song. Here's what Nietzsche knew when he said you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos is solitude. It's the place where you're not performing, not pursuing, not pretending. It's where you discover that you're already complete, that you've always been complete, that the void you've been trying to fill with women's approval was actually just the space where your authentic self was supposed to live. The cracked mirror of solitude reflects something truer than any relationship ever could. It shows you what you are when you're not trying to be anything for anyone. And yes, it's lonely sometimes. Yes, there are nights when the bed feels too big and the silence feels too loud. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. And once you learn that difference, you become dangerous in the best way possible. Dangerous to a system that depends on your desperation. Dangerous to relationships that require your diminishment. Dangerous to a world that profits from your incompleteness. So here's my final question, offered like a key to a door you're not sure you want to open. What if you're not broken? What if your solitude isn't a problem to be solved, but a throne to be claimed? What if every moment you spend chasing someone else is a moment you're running from the magnificent, terrifying possibility that you might actually be enough? The river Diogenes sat beside is still flowing. The barrel is still empty. The sunlight is still there, waiting for you to stop letting others cast shadows across it. Welcome to the kingdom of nothing. Population, you. And that, my friend, might just be everything.